This is On Assignment.
Hey everybody, we are coming to you with another jam-packed edition of On Assignment, your backstage pass to the Voice of America. I'm Alex Villarreal.
And I'm Philip Alexio in for Imran Siddiqui. Coming up on the program, the U.S. Secretary of State returns from the Middle East. We'll hear about the trip from our correspondent who traveled with him.
A billion mouths to feed and more on the way. China attempts to buy the world's biggest pork producer.
After a brutal attack, an American woman receives a new face. We'll talk with the reporter who interviewed her.
And a satirical take on Iranian politics straight from our studios in New York. We'll hear from the show's producers.
And don't go away, we're going on assignment.
Now, here in Washington, no one has been busier recently than U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. The former Massachusetts senator and one-time U.S. presidential candidate recently returned from a trip to Jordan where he announced agreement on a basis for resuming Israeli-Palestinian peace talks.
Well, joining us now is our VOA State Department correspondent, Scott Stearns, also one very busy fellow, and he traveled with John Kerry on this trip. And the Senator John Kerry has been in this position now for about 6 months, Scott. So, at least so far as you can tell, how would you compare his approach to the Middle East compared to the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton?
Secretary Kerry has been far more engaged. I think even Secretary Clinton would say that. In part, largely because he has the mandate from President Obama, who, as you know, at the start of his second term, went to Jerusalem, met with Prime Minister Netanyahu, met with President Abbas, reinvigorated, if you will, the U.S. approach to the Middle East peace process and gave Secretary Kerry that job. So he's been at it. This was our sixth trip to the region in 6 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now in a trip like this, you know, you're traveling with the Secretary of State. You have traveled in the past with U.S. presidents, specifically George W. Bush. How do those kinds of trips compare, and what's it like for you as a journalist?
I would say it's a big difference. The biggest difference is access, really. I mean, I've been on White House trips where you could spend a week in Asia and you never see the president. You're on the charter behind him, then you're in a filing center, then you're in a bus, then, you know.
So you're just getting information
exactly right. You're essentially watching the president on television from whatever sort of filing center you are. And on State Department trips, it's far different. There is no press charter. So if you're on the trip, you're on his plane.
Wow.
You're in the back of his plane in the coach seats, but still you're on the plane. So you have far greater access both to the people who are around the secretary and the secretary himself. I would say that in the half dozen trips that I've made maybe with Secretary Kerry now, he comes back more often than Secretary Clinton. She would come back at least once on a trip.
To talk to you.
To talk to us, off the record entirely. What's said in those conversations on the plane are not for attribution in any way, shape, or form. It's not a senior U.S. official, it's not a Western diplomat, it's no one. That's just information to help you sort of understand what's going on.
Background knowledge.
Well, now the United States does not have the most stellar reputation in the Arab world right now. And since John Kerry has been traveling around the Middle East here for a long time, at least for the first 6 months, how's he being received?
He has been received, I believe, quite warmly in the region, in part because having spent 29 years in the Senate, he is known. He has personal relationships with many of these leaders in the Gulf and in the Middle East. But you're right to make the point that the reputation of the United States has suffered from the perception that it is an unabashed ally of Israel. And Secretary Kerry hears, I think, throughout the region, that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is one that affects all other issues in the region. The right of return, on the Syrian issue, in Lebanon, and if the Obama administration can be seen to be playing an active role in bringing these two sides together, it's the view, at least among U.S. diplomats, that that will help them on other issues.
All right, Scott, well, thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us today, and we know you will be keeping a close eye on Secretary of State Kerry. All right, again, this is Scott Stearns, our State Department correspondent. We are taking a break now. Coming up, will America's largest pork processor become the property of China? You're watching On Assignment.
Smithfield Foods, which bills itself as the world's largest pork producer, is a U.S. company, but now a Chinese company wants to buy it. Lawmakers here in Washington have said not so fast, questioning what the takeover could mean for U.S. competitiveness and food security.
Right, and food production has already seen massive changes with growing demand worldwide for meat, milk, and eggs. Small-scale production has given way to large industrial-scale operations, but the transition already in effect in the United States has also spawned a movement in the other direction, with increasing demand now for small-scale, locally raised products.
Well, VOA agriculture reporter Steve Baragona has been looking at the trends and talked with On Assignment's Doug Bernard. Let's check it out.
You've been on large-scale farms, you've been on very small-scale farms. What are the things that you notice that are different about these two operations?
Well, you know, with a small farm, this is kind of what we think of as your quintessential farm. And the large farms are definitely, you know, it's more of an industrial kind of operation. You've got, you know, hundreds, thousands of animals inside a building. The building is, you know, to a certain extent climate controlled. The disposal of waste is controlled. It doesn't feel like what you think of as a farm. Now, what we think of as a farm, you know, there's a certain element of romanticism that we have to this kind of mythical past.
Simple life, pastoral setting, gentleman farmer, that sort of thing.
That's the idea.
A growing number of people, like Kevin Summers in Amissville, Virginia, are returning to small-scale farming.
In order to feed the world, I think this is a better way. It's, you know, it's a cleaner way, it's a more humane way.
More Americans today want to know where their food comes from, and they like the personal touch that Summers gives his hogs.
I can see the entire process unfold before my eyes and know that they had a good life and were healthy and happy.
So large-scale farms are efficient, they're more profitable. Why would people then want to go, say in pork production, why would they want to go back to a small-scale farm?
Well, there's a lot of the things that people don't like about the large scale. When you have that many animals in a small space, they create a lot of pollution. You've got to deal with the waste somehow. And there's the use of antibiotics is a concern. There's actually a fairly strong animal rights movement in this country that sees some of the practices as inhumane. And, you know, as far as the small-scale farms, I think the people who go into that kind of farming feel a real passion for the food system, for the quality of the food. I mean, they rave about the flavor. Chefs rave about the flavor. You know, people who really know what pork should taste like always go for these, you know, kind of the kinds of pigs that are raised in small-scale farms because they eat a more complex diet. There's, you know, it really depends on what you're going for.
China has recently said that they're interested in purchasing Smithfield, which is the largest U.S. pork producer. Why would they want to do that?
Getting a company like Smithfield would be a real asset for them because Smithfield is the world's largest pork producer, so they have huge technologies of scale or economies of scale, so they can produce a large amount for inexpensively. There was a hearing on Capitol Hill that looked at this and said there was a lot of skepticism from the senators at this hearing, a lot of skepticism. There are concerns that the Chinese will do as they have done very successfully in other industries. They will adopt this technology and export to our largest pork consumer, Japan, which is, of course, right next door to China. This is potentially a food security issue for the U.S. Would China buy Smithfield and then export all of Smithfield's pork to China, thereby raising the price of pork in the U.S. There are folks who raise food safety concerns. Certainly been problems with food safety in China, and having a Chinese company in charge of a U.S. company raises concerns, although You know, people say that, well, they'd still be subject to all the U.S. laws on food safety. It's something that raises concerns.
And again, that was VOA's agriculture reporter Steve Baragona. Now, Hong Kong-based Shengwei International's $4.7 billion offer to buy Smithfield Foods is the biggest proposed Chinese takeover of a U.S. company to date.
Amazing. Well, we're taking another break, but coming up, a story of incredible heartbreak and courage. You're watching On Assignment.
All right, so our next story is one of remarkable tragedy, but even more remarkable resilience. 6 years ago, an American woman's life changed dramatically when her estranged husband attacked her with lye. The attack left Carmen Tarleton virtually blind and horrifically disfigured with extensive chemical burns.
But in 2011, Tarleton received some good news. Doctors had found her a new face, and earlier this year she became the 5th person in the U.S. to undergo a full-face transplant.
VOA Urdu Service reporter Sarah Zaman interviewed Carmen about it and came away with a new appreciation for the strength of the human spirit. Let's watch.
In September 2007, a few weeks after her divorce, Carmen's ex-husband broke into her house, beat her with a baseball bat, and doused her with lye. The attack lasted a few minutes and burnt over 80% of Carmen's body. When it was over, Carmen was blind and her face was scarred beyond recognition.
Most of our marriage was good. He was not abusive in any way, not verbally, emotionally, or physically, until the night he attacked me.
Almost 4 years after the attack, in December 2011, Carmen's doctor gave her life-changing news. She had been selected as a candidate for a face transplant. Doctors would remove her scarred face and replace it with a healthy one. But surgery would be risky, as Carmen's immune system was weak after years of invasive medical treatments. Her body might reject the new face if doctors were able to find one. It took nearly a year, but doctors finally came across 54-year-old Cheryl Reiter, who had recently died of a stroke. Her kidneys, liver, and arm tissue had already been donated to 4 different people. Her daughter decided to donate her mother's face as well.
The facial transplant, all of that, these were big decisions, but also really easy for me to make because of the person that my mother was.
What inspired you to profile her?
I saw her when she made her appearance right after the face transplant. I saw her in a press conference on TV, and I thought that this is a story that's going to resonate a lot with our primary audience, which is people in Pakistan. Acid attacks are a harsh, tragic reality in Pakistan, and to see that something similar happened to somebody over here, but that through the advancement in science, they were actually able to help this person lead a life that's more normal than what acid attack victims in Pakistan have.
For the next 3 months, Carmen was kept in a medically induced coma. During this time, doctors at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts, performed close to 40 surgeries on her and gave her a new lease on life. But this life came with new challenges.
I really struggled with being completely blind. I was 39 years old, and I was struggling because I had all of these wounds. I had all these open wounds for 4 years, and so the first couple of years I couldn't see them. I couldn't see what everybody was talking about.
But even in her darkest hours, Carmen did not lose hope.
I don't know how much I really soaked in at the time, but I kept myself pretty strong about it.
Working for the Urdu Service, this obviously, as you said, your primary audience is in Pakistan. So what were you hoping in doing this story and in profiling Carmen that people in Pakistan might take away from it?
So when I was going to do this story, my idea was that people in Pakistan, because they don't expect something like this to happen in the US, will find this different. So, you know, part of always doing a story is the oddity, that it's going to be a different thing for your viewers.
And they'll relate to it because of their own
Exactly. The other thing
yeah.
was that they'll be able to relate to it because they have seen similar events. And the third thing was the idea of a face transplant. You can have partial facial transplant, you can have a full face transplant. So I think I wanted to not just highlight the issue of violence, but also kind of focus on the kind of treatment that's possible in the world today.
What was it like for you talking to her?
See, before going to meet her, I was talking to a friend who's a psychologist, and I was just talking to her about, okay, how can I prepare myself well to show respect to her? But when I went there and I started talking to her, in about 10 minutes, one, I was completely in awe of her because of her demeanor. And secondly, I felt so much more comfortable. And I told her, I said, I was worried before meeting you, but you put people at ease.
So many more goodness that's come out of it than the negativity that he first started. I want people to know that no matter what challenges come into their life, the challenges have come to propel them to a new place, and there's nothing that they can't overcome. And I truly, truly believe that with all my heart. Ta-da! Okay.
So Phil, we both had a hand in working on that story. You produced it, and then I interviewed Sarah. And I do have to say, it was an incredibly inspiring piece to watch.
It's heart-wrenching. It's really got all the emotions in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we are pleased to report that Carmen Tarleton now has a boyfriend. And she also has a new book out about her life titled Overcome, Burned, Blinded, and Blessed.
That's very inspirational. Thanks again to Sarah Zaman of VOA's Urdu service for that story. Well, there are many language services here at the Voice of America, and among them is the Persian News Network, or PNN, which broadcasts in Farsi to Iran. But PNN is popular for much more than straight news.
Yeah, that's right. So one of PNN's shows is called OnTen, and it's an edgy, satirical news show that pokes fun at Iranian officials. Yeah, a lot of that going on. The award-winning show is broadcast weekly from VOA studios in New York, and I caught up with the show's executive producer, Saman Arbabi, and host Arash Sobani to find out more. Let's watch.
سلام، من سامان اربابی ام. اینم هست برنامه آنتن. وزارت اطلاعات از خبرگزاری فارس به علت دروغگویی شکایت کرد. ثانیه‌هایی پس از وصول این شکایت، فیوز کل قوه قضاییه پرید.
So, Salman Arash, this show that you do on 10 is a satirical look at Iran and at officials in Iran. Why do you think this kind of show has so much appeal?
It's mostly a personal taste, but I think it's something that we have in common with millions and millions of younger Iranians inside Iran who are pretty much tired of either propaganda or just bitter news about like what's going on in the region, because the news mostly that comes out of the Iran or around Iran is normally not a good news to talk about around your your dining table. So we use sense of humor to make it a little bit more appealing, and also to disarm everything away from politics and religion and the hard news attitude by making it more digestible, I guess.
Well, I think there's Iran is a very complex country right now. We have I think the average age of Iranians is very, it's a very young country in terms of population, and there's a majority of these people, they don't have a voice, they don't have access to a TV channel to express their views. They don't have they're not allowed to write on the newspapers. So there's a silent majority that they need to express themselves, to vent out their feelings. So what we're trying to do to give these people a voice and to create a dialogue between different segments of the society, and satire is always a good medium to do that. Humor always helps, and we are not trying to. We don't have any goals to direct people or to give them directions or anything. We just want them to think, to start to have a dialogue and to express themselves. That's probably what we're trying to achieve here.
خدمت شما تقدیم می‌کنم.
به مناسبت فرارسیدن هفته دولت، پینک فلوید در مکان هیئت رزمندگان و به همخوانی حاج منصور ارزی کنسرتی برگزار خواهد کرد.
Now, of course, this can be kind of controversial, right? You're deconstructing the messages that traditionally come out of Iran. Have you received any kind of backlash from this?
Well, we're actually proud of that because when the officials in Iran, they watch our segments, we know that they're following us and they respond in their media, in their TV, in their websites. You know, from time to time they make responses, and they're very. It shows that they really are concerned about how we look at them, and that's a good thing because we hope that eventually they'll revisit how they're treating the people.
And this show seems to have some similarities to Parazit, which is a show that gained immense popularity inside of Iran. How is this show similar and how is it different?
It's pretty much the same thing, except 4 years of experience behind it. Parazit took at least about 1.5 years, 2 years before it got any kind of recognition. I think on Facebook, our first year, we had 16,000 fans. This week is our first anniversary or 52nd episode. We have 110,000 fans. And times have changed. Parazit came out of a time when the Iranian uprising was huge. Now we're dealing with a different atmosphere. Now we have to do a different style. We have to keep up with the weekly politics, talk about the future, talk about the past, go back to the archives. So it's a more mature show, but the foundations are all the same.
And OnTen is broadcast by satellite to Iran and is also available on the Persian page of voanews.com, Facebook, and YouTube. And if you're wondering how the show got its title, OnTen is actually a play on words, meaning antenna in Farsi, but it's slang for spy.
Well, now from the small screen to the big screen, drive-in movie theaters were once very popular in the United States. The outdoor theaters reached their peak in the late 1950s, and these days they can be hard to find.
Right, hard to find, but hardly old news. Some drive-ins still bring in big crowds just like they did in the old days. VOA producer June So went to one popular drive-in in Virginia. Let's ride along in her car and have a look.
Cars line up at the entrance to the Family Drive-In Theater in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley. It's about 130 kilometers from Washington, D.C.
Right there behind you, y'all. Blessed evening. Enjoy. Yes, ma'am.
The first drive-in opened in New Jersey in 1933. By 1958, there were 4,000 in the U.S. They began to disappear rapidly in the 1970s and 80s. Today, fewer than 400 are still operating. In the early years, drive-ins were a popular date destination. Now they mostly attract families. Cobb's Theater even has a playground where children can play before the movies start. 15 members of Fred Cunliffe's family drove from Texas, North Carolina, and other parts of Virginia for tonight's show.
It's something that we used to do as kids with my parents. So we just thought it'd be a really nice family event to come to the drive-in and let the kids get to see everything going on.
The theater maintains itself through the sale of food and drink. And there's a new challenge. Drive-ins will have to convert to digital projection by the end of the year when movie studios stop distributing 35mm films.
It's $70,000 per projector. So for my theater, it's $140,000 worth of debt that I have to take on to go digital.
Some drive-ins may not survive. Yet fans hope to enjoy movies under the stars for years to come. For producer June So, Amy Katz, VOA News.
And with that, we've come to the end of another edition of On Assignment. Very interesting show this week, and we hope you all enjoyed it as we did.
And next week, look for my story about a group in Los Angeles that is helping ex-gang members turn their lives around.
We'll also say farewell to legendary White House correspondent Helen Thomas, who recently passed away.
Check out On Assignment anytime, night or day at voanews.com, Facebook, and YouTube.
Until next time, thanks so much for watching, and have a great week.